Hey everyone, this is Patrice Coleman, and I want to welcome you all to my Patreon video. This is my first one that I'm going to be doing on Patreon, and I'm basing it actually on one of my channels, PM Coleman, aka the Positivity Corner. I did a poll several months ago and listed a number of Netflix documentaries specifically that have to do with music. And I asked which one my subscribers and non subscribers would like me to review. And this was the winner with over 50% of the voting. So I am going to do a quick review of this documentary on the iconic Sam Cooke. And this is from 2019, folks. It's called Remastered: The Two Killings of Sam Cooke. A Sam Cooke story. Now, on my channel, the Positivity Corner, I do videos of artists, my favorite artists and my favorite tunes. And I did several on Sam Cooke because he is one of my favorite singers of all time. Not just soul R&B, folks. All time singers. Just a magnificent, magnificent voice. A legendary voice indeed. But I have to admit, I didn't know a whole lot about him. So when this particular video won the poll, I was, kind of happy about it because I wanted to see and learn more about him. And this title is interesting. It really talks about his legacy. When they say the two killings of Sam Cooke, they mean the physical death of Sam Cooke, but also the death of his legacy. Yeah, that's really what the title means. And this documentary actually begins with him singing, and I tell you, it is just so thrilling to hear him sing. And it's actually a live performance that was done in Harlem, and the actual recording didn't get released until I think 1985. I'm not sure of the circumstances why, but you hear the various people who are going to speak in the documentary listening to his incredible voice. And there are a number of people in this documentary, including Dionne Warwick, Jim Brown, Smokey Robinson, who talk about Sam Cooke and his life. And there's a couple of, themes that kind of run through this documentary. The first thing is, and most importantly, is that he was a human being. Yeah, he was a great singer and he had a lot of success, but he was a human being and he was complicated. That's the first thing. And the other thing was specifically having to do with the record companies and how they tried their best to keep him contained, which is what they did to a lot of African American artists in the United States at that time. You're talking about the 50s and the 60s, folks. There were a lot of injustices done to artists of color at that time, and it happened to Sam Cooke too. But as he increasingly got involved in civil rights, we're talking late 50s, early 60s, of course, he actually broke through some significant barriers, which I certainly was not aware of. And also, they talk about his relationships with Malcolm X, Jim Brown, Muhammad Ali, and how they're coming together as a group of friends was perceived ultimately as a threat. Those are some of the main themes of this documentary, and it's unfortunate, I think, that his death and the circumstances of his death, he was shot to death, and the circumstances to this day are murky at best, not too clear. It kind of cut short his legacy in a huge way, and the circumstances of his death diminished his legacy as well. They talk about his death at the beginning of this documentary, in not in detail as much as they do at the end, but they do talk about people's responses to his death. 200,000 people showed up to pay their respects to Sam Cooke in Chicago. That's how popular this guy was. But there was a feeling, as I said, he was shot to death, that the investigation of his death was kind of dismissed. He was just another black man in a segregated society. So that's why I say his legacy got diminished by the circumstances. And it discusses how he was born in Mississippi. His great grandparents were slaves. How his family moved to Chicago. He had a religious background, and he started singing gospel music seriously as a teenager and young adult. He joined one of the most popular gospel groups of all time, the Soul Stirrers, and his career took off initially as a gospel artist. Yeah. It also talks about Chicago at that time in the 40s and 50s, how, of course, it was segregated because cities were segregated at that time, but there was a thriving black entrepreneurial community in Chicago, and there were a lot of successful black owned businesses, and that really influenced him and encouraged him to be an entrepreneur later in his recording career. And also the church, of course, was influential. And it talks in detail about him going down south to tour as a member of the Soul Stirrers and being very upset by the conditions that African American artists had to put up with in the South during segregation. They mentioned Emmett Till, who of course was in the Chicago area. Of course, 1955, his murder and subsequent funeral. It really, really encouraged Sam Cooke to get more active in the civil rights movement. That incident with Emmett Till and his murder. He was still in gospel though, but he increasingly got interested in R&B and the beginnings of soul music because he wanted to reach a wider audience than he could in gospel. And in 1957, of course, he started his secular recording career had a huge hit, You Send Me, right? And it gave him leverage that he would not have had, I think, as a gospel artist. There are a number of incidents during his career that are described. One with Dick Clark, where Dick Clark actually had to call out the National Guard for protection because he was being threatened by the Klan. This is Atlanta. They threatened him, Dick Clark, because he had Sam Cooke on his show. It seems crazy now, but that's the kind of stuff that happened. At this point, he moves to L.A., Sam Cooke, but he goes back down south to tour, and there's a few more incidents that are described where he actually had to stick up for his entourage, which of course was black people, when they were confronted by racist citizens and the police. Sam Cooke did not want to be taken advantage of. That was the thing that I got from this documentary. He wanted his rights. The problem was for him that at that time, too, as a recording artist, the audiences were actually segregated. White people used to sit in the balconies, black people sat on the floor, yada, yada, yada. Even though they were in the same arena or hall or concert hall or whatever, they were still segregated. And in 1961, he actually refused to perform in Memphis. He was one of the first people to do this. First African-American artist that I can think of to actually do this. And this was something that I learned because I did not know this. And it was a big risk when you think about it. This 1961, he could have got killed for that. But he felt it was the right thing to do. He grew politically. He met Muhammad Ali before Muhammad Ali converted to Islam. Of course, he was Cassius Clay at that point. And they bonded. And, as I mentioned before, he met Malcolm X and Jim Brown. He was influenced by James Baldwin's work. He continued to evolve as a black man. And not only did he evolve politically, but as a businessman, he actually started his own publishing company and record label, which was unheard of for an African-American artist to do. He fought for royalties, which were systematically being denied to black artists. He was perceived as a threat, though, by the record companies as well because of what he was doing. He started singing protest songs like Bob Dylan, Blowing in the Wind, for example, at his concerts. He wrote A Change Is Gonna Come, which was released after his death. As a result of that growth, it's an interesting documentary. I wish they had more footage, I guess, of him performing. They've got, clips here and there. I think overall the documentary is worth it. I was really kind of surprised about his death and all the circumstances of that, because as I said earlier, it's still kind of murky. There are tons of conspiracy theories about it, that he was set up by the FBI and other people. Hot mess, just a hot mess. And I think all of that diminished his legacy. Certainly the circumstances of his death. And the fact that he was 33 years old, he was moving forward in such a big way mentally as a black man in America in the 60s, fighting for equality, and to be cut down like that. His potential, I think, was unlimited. That is the sad part about his life, in my opinion. Is this documentary worth watching? Yeah, I think so. I think so. I learned a few things, certainly, about him that I didn't know. I didn't know the extent, actually, of his activism or his entrepreneurship. So those were two things that I learned. I think it's definitely worth a look. It's a little bit, I think, over an hour. I think it's about an hour and 15 minutes or something like that. And as I said, it has people that you may know in the documentary. No, Dionne Warwick. I think Lloyd Price is in it. There's people you don't know, people who were tied to him, people who worked with him on his records. I think his personal secretary and some other people who were still alive in 2019. It's definitely, I think, worth a look. So there you have it. Remastered The Two Killings of Sam Cooke, a Sam Cooke story. Check it out on Netflix. And I will be back with more content on Patreon. And thank you so much for your support. Take care, everyone.